Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and OG Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, a tech writer and general nerd.
That's all you have to say this week.
That's all I've got. I'm just a nerd.
Short yet sweet.
A lowly nerd.
Today we're going to look at macOS 10. The story of macOS 10 is really the story of how Steve Jobs returned to Apple and saved it from oblivion in 1997. Back then, the future of the company looked bleak. The venerable macOS was showing its age. It didn't have the features we take for granted today, like multitasking and support for multiple processors. It didn't even have memory protection, which meant it kept crashing. The board appointed a new CEO to turn things around, Gil Amelio. He came out with a strategy for the Mac's next-gen operating system, which he called Rhapsody. The idea was to buy a modern core OS and put the Mac user interface layer on top of it. Amelio's strategy wasn't bad, but it was too little, too late. Fortunately, the OS Amelio chose for his Rhapsody strategy was NeXTSTEP, from a company called Next that happened to belong to Steve Jobs. And Apple's acquisition of Next resulted in Jobs' fateful return to the company. If you're interested in finding out more about Next, you should check out our previous episode. In this episode, we'll tell the story of how, in just 2 years, Jobs managed to oust Amelio as CEO, fix his flawed strategy, and add a new UI so shiny you could lick it. And then he renamed the whole thing macOS 10. This is a story of technology geniuses, technology ignoramuses, and a lot of skullduggery and backstabbing. So if you're here for the drama, I don't think this week we're going to disappoint.
I think it's ignoramus, just before people write in.
Sorry?
I think it's ignoramus, not ignoramus.
Oh, ignoramus. Oh dear, okay. As we like to do on this show, before we get into it, Charlie, I have a couple of teaser questions. Now, I think these are going to be tough, but we'll see what you make of them. What's the difference between Carbon and Cocoa?
Well, they're both developing environments for the Mac. Did you want me to tell you all the differences between them?
Yeah, I mean, what do you know of Carbon and Cocoa? Because that's part of what we're going to get into in this episode.
I know that Cocoa is an object-oriented programming...
Oh, very good.
Well, environment or language.
Yeah.
And it succeeded Carbon.
That is very interesting, and there's lots of things we're going to touch on there. So I'm going to park that down. We're going to come back to it.
All right.
As we usually do. Just want to set the scene before we get into this.
Okay, set the scene.
The year is 1996. It was all coming back to Celine Dion. The Spice Girls were wannabes. Toni Braxton wanted us to unbreak her heart. And R. Kelly believed he could fly. But some things don't change. Adidas track pants were all the rage. And Tom Cruise was on a Mission Impossible at the box office. Charlie, do you have fond recollections of 1996?
Let's see, 96. I don't have many recollections. So I guess it was a good year.
Clearly it was. But it was not a good year. For Apple, lots of Mac users were deserting the platform. All the design studios that I remember from that period, they were all actually either in the process of migrating to Windows NT or they had already done so. So the user base for the Mac was dwindling. And that's the reason why by the time you get to the late 90s, Apple as a company had almost gone bust. The Mac system was flaky and dated, and there was really no confidence left in its user base that Apple was going to be able to solve any of these problems. So against that background, a new CEO was appointed called Gil Amelio. Charlie, what do you know about Gil Amelio?
I know that the 20th century Macintosh was his baby.
Oh, was it? I didn't know that.
I think it was, yeah, I think that was the case. That he was pushing it. And to the extent that as part of his severance package, he took the 20th anniversary Mac. He loved it so much. As if he couldn't have, I don't know, I guess it shows you how expensive that was that he didn't want to buy one himself.
I think that Apple probably at that point didn't have any cash to pay him, so it was easier to pay him in Macs.
Yeah, that's it.
Gil Amelio, in my opinion, gets a bit of an unfair treatment in his years at Apple. And when I say years, actually, it was barely years. It was actually 500 days. In fact, he wrote a book about his time at Apple called In the Firing Line, My 500 Days at Apple. So he did not work at Apple for very long. But even though people tend to position him as being a terrible CEO, I guess I have a slightly different take on this. I would say that he was probably one of Apple's better CEOs because he made some of the most important decisions in Apple's history. And he left Apple in a much better position than he found it. And he kind of also managed himself out of a job. And I think those qualities are actually what you look for in any manager. I think any good manager is always in the process of managing themselves out of a job. That is what Gil Amelio did. The most important and consequential decision that he made was to buy Next and to bring Steve Jobs back into the company and to pick NeXTSTEP as the next generation operating system for the Mac platform. And given that Steve Jobs is then widely credited to have turned the company around, and NeXTSTEP is essentially the platform that Apple still uses to this day for its products, I would say that's, for a CEO in 500 days, that's not a bad rap sheet.
Yeah, that's a pretty good run.
I think so, yeah. Gil Amelio was not stupid. A lot of things, but he wasn't stupid. And in fact, unlike most CEOs that Apple's had, he was a genuine technologist and engineer. In fact, he is credited with the patent for charged couple devices. Do you know what those are?
CCDs. That's that's what goes inside a camera or video. Well, it started off with video cameras.
Yeah.
And that's not, they don't use them anymore, but it's now we have CMOS sensors and things like this. But yeah, it's a sensor, camera sensor.
Yeah. So he was the co-creator of that, listed on the patent. He is a smart guy. I think one of the reasons why he gets a tough deal is because he was quite boring and he was a really bad presenter. And those are not qualities that you expect from an Apple CEO, I guess. Although I'm not sure that Tim Cook is the most charismatic of presenters either.
Nah, he's... I like watching Tim Cook, though, because when he's not happy about something, you just see it on his face so much.
He gives away more than he realizes. That's true.
Exactly.
He has tells.
Yeah, he does. He seems very dull, and he's kind of his enthusiasm very often seems fake. Although I'm sure it isn't. It just looks like that.
Okay, one additional reason why Gil Amelio is not highly regarded as a CEO is because Steve Jobs did not regard him very highly as a CEO. In fact, Steve Jobs once said that Gil Amelio is the worst CEO I'd ever seen. If you needed a license to be a CEO, he wouldn't get one. Which is kind of harsh. Right?
Another Steve Jobs sick burn.
But that feeling between Steve Jobs and Gil Amelio was mutual. The first time that Amelio met Steve Jobs was in 1996, shortly after he had been appointed, and Steve Jobs dropped by to say hello. Amelio describes Steve Jobs this way. He said, he looked rather like a boxer, aggressive and elusively graceful, or like an elegant jungle cat ready to spring at its prey. So first impressions for Gil Amelio meeting Steve Jobs were not great. But he did warm up to Steve Jobs later. The way he described it was, I was hooked in by Steve's energy and enthusiasm. He made me feel like a lifelong friend. Jobs was getting to know Gil Amelio and getting friendly with Gil Amelio because obviously Jobs was obsessed with Apple. Now, he pretended that he wasn't because he had his own company Next, and much more successfully, he had Pixar. And by the late 90s, Pixar has released Toy Story. So he's got real success for the first time since the early days of Apple, and he's super excited about Pixar. But somehow there's something about Apple. It's like this itch that he can't help scratching. He can't leave it alone.
It's like his first love, his first girlfriend in school. You know, he's still hooked on it.
Exactly. He has this deep, abiding love for Apple. I guess combined with a chip on his shoulder that he was booted out. So I think he also didn't have closure. There was more that he was going to do with Apple, and he was interrupted. I think the rational part of Steve Jobs' mind during this period knows that he shouldn't and can't go back to Apple, but he can't leave it alone. And he can't leave Gil Amelio alone either. There's a really interesting ambivalence about Jobs during this period because he doesn't want to admit that he wants Gil Amelio's job, but he very evidently does want Gil Amelio's job. And you hear this from multiple sources. Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle at the time.
Playboy CEO of Oracle.
The Playboy CEO of Oracle and a close friend of Steve Jobs. They were often having talks about Steve Jobs returning to Apple as CEO. Larry Ellison offered to buy Apple for Steve so that he could return as CEO.
That's very Larry Ellison.
Yeah, very doable at the time because Apple's share price had just tanked. So he could have just done that. But Steve Jobs didn't want to do it that way. I think that part of him, he wanted to be begged to return. You know, he wanted there to be this full acknowledgement that the missing ingredient at Apple was Steve Jobs all along, which, as it turns out, is
It was true.
It was true. Yeah, he was right. But he wanted them to acknowledge that, and he wanted them to beg. So at this point, he's really sniffing around the company. He's very, very interested, but he's not showing his hand. And Gil Amelio is presented with, I think, one of the toughest challenges that any CEO might face. Apple is losing money left, right, and center. It's hemorrhaging cash. And the sales team are channel stuffing. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, this is, you think that if you sell 100 Macs, you've sold 100 Macs and 100 people have got a new Mac. Whereas what happens with channel stuffing is, say you're selling through, I don't know, Best Buy or something like that, and you sell 10,000 Macs to Best Buy, and they're sitting on Best Buy shelves, but you count them as sales, even though you haven't actually sold them to an end user.
Exactly. Yeah. So Apple's financials were bad, but the channel stuffing was hiding the fact that actually they were even worse because it's not really sold if the retail channel can return it to Apple again.
Mm-hmm.
And so Apple's financial position was absolutely dire and its cash position was worse. There was every chance that they would just run out of cash and go bankrupt. Not only this, but as we touched on at the start, there was this OS problem. Although the hardware that Macs were running on was actually quite good for the time, the operating system was absolutely terrible.
So tell me, which one are we on in 96? Weren't we on Mac OS 9?
No, we're on System 7. System 7 lasts until 1997.
Right, got it.
So prior to Steve Jobs' return, they'd just been stuck on System 7, which was really showing its age. And so it's not only that the financials were very, very bad, but the technology sucked as well. So there wasn't really a way around this. One of the first decisions Gil Amelio made was to say, look, guys, this isn't going anywhere. We have to admit defeat and buy or license an operating system from someone else. One of the ideas he had, and this is a weird sort of alternate reality that could have happened, that he was looking at Windows NT as the operating system for Macs.
Oh my God. What a difference that would have made.
If your choice was to buy basically a PC running Windows NT that Apple had fiddled with versus a proper PC running a proper version of Windows NT, which would you buy?
I mean, you might prefer the Apple one. The thing is, if it's just a PC at that point running Windows, then Apple's can't be more expensive because then no one's going to buy it.
The next thing that he was considering was an operating system called BIOS.
Uh-huh.
Do you know much about this?
Not much.
Do you know the guy behind BIOS? The CEO of the company?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this is a French guy called Jean-Louis Gasset.
Oh, yes.
So Jean-Louis Gasset was a former director of European operations at Apple. And there are a few people on the planet that Steve Jobs hated more than him. The Steve Jobs quote here is, Gasset is one of the few people in my life I would say is truly horrible. He knifed me in the back in 1985.
Well, so that's it. So he doesn't actually dislike him. He just hates him because he knifed him in the back.
Well, yeah, but I guess truly horrible is saying something. Steve Jobs actually forgave a lot of people, including some of the board directors who had voted against him. He did subsequently forgive, but he never forgave Gasset. 1985 was the year that Steve Jobs was booted out of Apple. Or rather, Steve Jobs resigned because he felt his position was no longer tenable. And this was after he tried to engineer a boardroom coup to get John Scully booted out. And the reason that Scully got wind of this is because Jean-Louis told him.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jean-Louis Gasset was kind of responsible for what happened in 1985 and Steve Jobs leaving Apple.
Mm-hmm.
And Jean-Louis Gasset has a weird obsession with Steve Jobs as well. In fact, you could look at the whole of Gasset's career as sort of a tribute career to Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
So when Steve Jobs left and founded Next and created a cube-shaped computer called the Next Cube,
mm-hmm.
Gasset left, founded BIOS, and created a computer called the B-Box.
Yeah.
A box-shaped computer. And it's like, okay, Jean-Louis, we see where you're going with this. And I think to this day, he still writes about Apple and opines over what Steve would have done.
But B-Box is a good name for a computer. I like it. You're not a fan. You don't like it? You wouldn't buy a B-Box? I don't know.
I feel like it's maybe trying to be a little. It's too try hard, isn't it?
I don't know. I guess like, are you gonna put on your baseball cap on backwards?
Yeah, exactly. So Jean-Louis Gasset thought that he had Gil Amelio over a barrel because Gasset didn't think that Apple had many other options than his operating system, BIOS. I really don't know why he didn't think about the possibility that Apple might also be considering buying NeXTSTEP, but he didn't. He basically overplayed his hand. I remember around this time in 1996, it was an open secret that Apple was going to buy someone else's operating system, and everyone assumed it was going to be BIOS. BIOS at the time was quite highly regarded as an operating system. The problem was really the same problem with NeXTSTEP, which is it's a chicken and egg problem, because if you don't have a user base, you don't have a developer base, and if you don't have a developer base, you don't have a user base. So ironically, even though Apple in 1996 didn't have an operating system, they had what was more valuable, which was an ecosystem. They actually had users and developers. The only thing that they didn't have was an operating system that didn't suck. That put them actually in a stronger position. And Gazet demanded 500 million was what he valued his company at. He had a handful of employees. So this was a massive overvaluation. Gil Amelio actually pegged the value of B at 50 million, so 10 times less. And this again is where I think Gil Amelio was right. And his view was, well, if you're asking that much, we're going to be looking at other options.
Yeah.
And so around this time, Steve Jobs wasn't making any overtures of selling Next to Apple. And in fact, those overtures started at middle management level, and that worked its way up the management tree to Steve Jobs and Gil Amelio. So Steve is interested. He picks up the phone to Gil and says, look, I know you're considering BIOS. I know you're considering Windows NT, but please don't make any decision until we've had a chance to talk. He really charms Gil Amelio, but he also presents a very compelling case. He talks about the brilliant technology that he has in NeXTSTEP, and he basically wows Gil Amelio. But it comes down to a final sales pitch on December the 10th, 1996, at the Garden Court Hotel in Palo Alto. And you've got Steve Jobs and Arve Tavanian presenting NeXTSTEP. And then you've got Jean-Louis Gauzet and a couple of his engineers presenting BIOS. And if you want a bit more on Arve Tavanian, then the previous episode that we did on NeXTSTEP can fill you in on that. Steve Jobs delivers a brilliant sales pitch, and Jean-Louis Gauzet is blasé. He thinks it's in the bag for BIOS, and he doesn't take it seriously. What Amelio later said was that Next was the clear winner by 50% or so in all the things we thought were important. So then, negotiating the deal, Steve Jobs wasn't really pushy on money, and Gil Amelio offered him a lot more than he had offered for BIOS. And the reason was because Next actually had income, it had customers, it had a user base. It was a much more established company than BIOS. Steve Jobs was actually pleasantly surprised by the offer. The only bone of contention was Gil Amelio said, you need to have some skin in the game if we're going to do this deal, so you have to accept some of your remuneration in shares of Apple. And Steve Jobs didn't want any shares in Apple. But Gil Amelio pushed, and Steve Jobs accepted that. And they had this gentleman's agreement that if Steve Jobs was going to dump his shares, he would tell Gil first. And Steve Jobs wasn't allowed to sell his shares until 6 months after the deal went through. 6 months after the deal went through, Steve Jobs immediately sold all of his shares and didn't tell Gil Amelio. And that was part of their falling out. To Amelio, this felt like a betrayal, and was one of the reasons that he came to realize that he couldn't entirely trust Steve Jobs, even though he had been charmed by Steve Jobs. Because the thing was, Jobs had so many shares that when he sold all of them at once in one day, it dumped the share price even further. And that the share price was like a big problem for Gil Amelio at the time. And Gil Amelio asked Steve point blank, did you do it? And Steve Jobs said no.
But so what was Jobs' role in at the time? Was he working back at Apple now?
That is a very, very good question. I mean, that is almost $1 million question, because Gil Amelio wanted Steve Jobs to come back to Apple, but Gil Amelio obviously wanted to still be the CEO. Now, I think if you're Steve Jobs with Steve Jobs' mindset, the only job title you'd really be prepared to take at a company is CEO. I think anything less for Steve Jobs at this point felt like a step down. And Gil Amelio was trying to persuade him to be head of operating systems or something like that. I mean, can you imagine? There's no way that Steve Jobs was going to take that. So you have this thing where Steve Jobs is obsessed with Apple. He wants to come back to Apple, but there are two reasons not to. One is because the job he wants, CEO, is not available. But an even bigger driver than that is maybe Apple is screwed. There's no reason to think that this company can be turned around.
So you think Jobs doesn't want to take the top job anyway because then he's going to get blamed for Apple failing?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is a time when finally Steve Jobs is achieving great success because he's the CEO of Pixar. And Pixar is beating Disney at its own game. And having that same success that he had in the early 80s with Apple, he's having that in the late 90s with Pixar. So the only thing he'll agree to is to come on board as a special advisor to Gil Amelio while he's still got his day job as the CEO of Pixar. Coming back to Gil Amelio and his plan to save Apple and the Mac, the reason that he's bought Next is because he wants to use NeXTSTEP as the basis for the next generation operating system for Mac, which he calls Rhapsody. Do you know, Charlie, why he called it Rhapsody?
I don't know. Something to do with Gershwin?
What about Gershwin?
Well, there's Rhapsody in Blue.
Exactly.
Which is, is famous.
Yeah, and what was Gershwin's connection to Apple?
That bit I don't know.
Okay, so at the time, in the 90s, they were naming these failed operating systems after American composers.
Mm-hmm.
And so Copeland, named after Stuart Copeland, was the next generation operating system that they never managed to get to work. But they actually had another, even more futuristic operating system that was supposed to come after Copeland that was called Gershwin.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, that's then why they, riffing on Gershwin and Rhapsody in Blue, then they decided to rename NeXTSTEP Rhapsody. It had a new name, but it was still essentially NeXTSTEP. The plans for Rhapsody were announced just days after the merger. And one of the things when I'm looking at this whole story that really astonishes me is just how quickly everyone moved on this. So the deal is signed on December 20th, 1996. And just 18 days later, on January 7th, 1997, Steve Jobs is up on stage with Gil Amelio presenting Rhapsody at Macworld San Francisco. Gil, in positioning this acquisition, says we're going to fuse the best of Mac and Next. He said what Next provided was a modern core OS, and there were three key things that it would deliver, which were stability, performance, and predictability. He said System 7 can't deliver the benefits of modern processors to the application. We'll include a link to this keynote in the show notes. It's fascinating to watch because it's the first keynote of Steve Jobs' second stint at Apple. And I felt like the script that Gil Amelio was reading, I'm almost certain Steve Jobs wrote it because it really reads like a Steve Jobs presentation. They have this metaphor. The macOS is like a Cessna light aircraft. And it was really great, and it could get you from A to B. It was perfect. But then the needs for macOS changed, and they show this cartoon of a Cessna with a happy smiley face, and then they start putting chairs on the wings, and the wings start sagging. It needed more seats for more passengers, and then it needed to go faster, so we got PowerPC, and it gets faster. So then we had to retrofit these new engines, and then it shows these jumbo jet engines strapped to the sides of the wings, and then the kind of brackets and things to hold it up, and the whole plane is looking sad and sagging.
Sounds like Microsoft saw this video and decided to use that as their roadmap for making Windows.
Steve Jobs made other vehicle computer metaphors. Famously he talked about how the iPad was like a car and the
Mac was a truck.
The Mac was a truck, and you need both for different things. And to me, there was something that was quintessentially Steve Jobs about the words that Gil Amelio was flubbing. So he explained Rhapsody with this PowerPoint slide, which had a bunch of layers that represented the system. And the bottom layers were all what he called the modern core OS. And that was basically the Mac kernel, the BSD subsystem, and a compositing layer, all of which we discussed in our previous episode on NeXTSTEP. And on top of all of that, he had a layer for running applications, which was divided into two boxes, a blue box and a yellow box. And the blue box was an emulation layer for running legacy Mac apps. In macOS 10, it was later called Classic. Charlie, do you remember Classic?
Yeah, I thought it was all right. So I had Classic on my first Mac, which was the iBook. So the one that came after the toilet seat iBook.
Yep.
It came with Classic, which meant that it was actually dual boot macOS 9 and macOS 10. But that macOS 10 could use a Classic environment. What that was it would let you run older apps which weren't yet made for macOS 10. But this was a bit different because the apps actually looked different because the macOS 10 looks so much different than macOS 9.
Yeah.
So you would be just running these older apps. That's right, no? I'm not remembering
Yeah,
it.
I mean, that's right. The way to think about this was if you think about Parallels or VMware or something like that, you can run a Windows environment on top of your Mac using something like VMware, right? But those Windows apps are not in any way interacting with your Mac operating system, or only in the crudest way. And this is basically what Gil Amelio planned to do. He would put some kind of virtualization thing in there to enable legacy Mac apps to run on it. But the problem with that is those legacy apps wouldn't get the benefit of all of the modern operating system stuff. The legacy Mac apps running on Rhapsody would still suck. And if the majority of your apps were legacy Mac apps, then Rhapsody would suck.
Yeah. Also with, when Classic came along, the problem was that Apple wasn't as powerful as it is now, and developers like Adobe, big developers, were not really motivated to update to Mac OS X. And I remember that was one of the things. It took Adobe a very long time, several years. You probably remember how many years exactly, to come up with a native OS X version of Photoshop. Before that, you had to keep running, and it ran fine, but you were running Photoshop in Classic or booting back into Mac OS 9 to use it.
That's right. It took about a year for Adobe to ship a native version of Photoshop for Mac OS X, but that actually wasn't such a bad outcome given that Adobe had flat refused to ever support Rhapsody. And so a little later in this episode, we'll get into what it was that Steve Jobs added to Mac OS X, the secret ingredient that persuaded Adobe to change their minds. In this presentation, I thought that Gil Amelio looked uncomfortable and nervous, and he kept ad-libbing and screwing things up. There was one thing particularly that I noticed when he was talking about Blue Box. He said, Blue Box will run all our legacy apps, and it will do so with equal or better performance than today. That's our problem. And it's
that's our problem.
And I thought, well, that's quite telling. It's like, well, how are you going to make that happen, Gil?
Yeah.
And
that sounds a bit like secret. That's our problem. Glance behind the curtain. A little bit too honest.
Yeah, that's tipping the hand way too much. So that's the blue box. But just coming back to Gil's PowerPoint slide, he had two boxes on the top layer of his system, and next to the blue box there was a yellow box. The yellow box ran a whole new breed of apps developed using NeXTSTEP's programming language, Objective-C, and it was these apps that would be able to take full advantage of Rhapsody's modern Core OS features. What Gil Amelio said that the yellow box as a minimum needed to deliver was predictive multitasking, memory protection, and symmetric multiprocessing. So, I mean, these things which should go without saying today, but System 7 couldn't even handle having multiple CPU cores. Steve Jobs then takes the stage when Gil Amelio has outlined the plan and then handed over to Steve Jobs. The color of the slides change. Gil Amelio is using these Apple corporate slides which have a white background with this horrible tint of the Apple logo in the background. Mm-hmm. And you switch to Steve Jobs and suddenly his slides have got a black background and they look way classier and much simpler and much more Steve Jobs.
Wow, it's like landing in the land of Oz.
Explain.
Well, in The Wizard of Oz, it starts out in black and white, and then when she's in Kansas, and then when she lands in Oz, it's bright Technicolor.
It's the way Steve Jobs can't even bear to use someone else's slide template.
That doesn't surprise me.
You know, that's the extent to which this is not joined up. As soon as you get Steve Jobs in this keynote, then there's something else going on. The ad-libbing, the awkward delivery, all comes to an end. And this is someone that feels like a CEO that's suddenly taken over. And he introduces NeXTSTEP to the audience. Now, a lot of the people in this audience will know nothing about NeXTSTEP. I mean, it's got some customers, but it's not got many. It's not like a big league operating system. And he describes it as advanced yet mature. He says that NeXTSTEP runs on lots of different processors. It can run on PowerPC. It can run on Intel. He said, I think it gives us a lot of choices in the future as to what processors we move to, because this stuff is processor independent.
That's very interesting.
Steve Jobs is just days back at the company, and he's already considering a post-PowerPC future when Apple might migrate to Intel.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, yeah, they moved to Intel and everything else, as we will see, I guess.
I think one of the things that Steve Jobs consistently does in all of his keynotes is he boils down the situation to something that is clear and simple you can get your head around. What Steve Jobs said the mission was for Apple in buying Next was to provide relevant, compelling solutions that customers can only get from Apple.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that second bit is something that he really enforced as being important, because it was no longer enough for Apple just to catch up with Microsoft. Because even if overnight the Mac got all the modern operating system things that Microsoft already had, why should anyone use it?
Yeah, if it's just as good, then you stick with what you've already got.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, in this sense, I think what Steve Jobs is saying here is, with where we're at, Microsoft has basically already won. And to turn things around, we need to deliver something that only Apple can deliver. It's not enough to just catch up. That's not going to get us anywhere. Another interesting Steve Jobs style metaphor, he uses a metaphor of like a skyscraper and people starting on different floors. Do you remember this?
No, I don't remember this one.
Okay. So he says that the Mac didn't progress much beyond the 5th floor over 10 years, and Microsoft has copied it now. And what he meant by the 5th floor was, as a developer, if you want to build apps for the Mac, when the Mac first came out, you had this Mac toolbox. And the Mac toolbox gave developers lots of tools that gave them a leg up. So they weren't starting from the ground, they were starting from the 5th floor, right?
Yeah.
So that made it much more attractive to develop apps for the Mac than it was to develop apps for MS-DOS, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true. The reason I think that's true is even Microsoft was releasing apps for Mac before it did for Windows. So stuff like Word and Excel and PowerPoint all came out on the Mac first. So what Jobs argued was, in the past 10 years, Microsoft had copied it and caught up. And this is obviously the 10 years when Steve Jobs wasn't at Apple.
Yeah,
And
not his fault.
It's not his fault. Everyone else has screwed it up. All these subsequent useless CEOs have screwed it up. I think, by the way, he's right about this. When he was booted out, he left them with an operating system that had a leading edge advantage. When he returns in 97, all of that advantage is gone. The Mac has gone nowhere in a decade. Microsoft has not just caught up, but they've leapt ahead. So the way he describes it is, when Microsoft added Windows to DOS, that put them on the 5th floor, same as Mac. So then there was no advantage to Mac. But then it's worse than that, because with Windows NT, which had all these modern operating system features, that put developers on the 7th floor, whereas Mac developers are still on the 5th floor.
What's on the 6th floor in this
We never found
story?
out what the 6th floor was, Charlie. Don't be difficult, okay? We're actually going to extend this metaphor to breaking point now. So if you had a trouble with the 6th floor, then just...
I'm not going to like this, am I?
just be ready for what comes next. He said they are a little ahead of us in getting a multi-threaded, multitasking operating system under Windows. But with macOS plus NeXTSTEP, we'll be putting developers on the 20th floor.
Oh, okay. 20th floor.
20th floor. And he has a diagram with 3 skyscrapers and...
Okay, one more question about this. Is this skyscraper, is it one of these that doesn't have a 13th floor? Or does it have a 13th floor? It's not that I want to go on the 13th floor. It's just to know how many floors there really are. Are there actually 20 or are there 19?
I'm not sure why there were 20 floors, Charlie. And Steve Jobs, I think, never related. But I think what he meant was it was a damn sight many floors than Windows NT was putting developers
I
on.
mean, this is typical Jobs flim-flam.
I'm afraid it is, yeah. Now, why the 20th floor? Why so many floors up? What did he think Apple, with acquiring NeXTSTEP, would be giving developers that was so awesome that it put you on such a high floor? And he goes back, amazingly, to his visit to Xerox PARC in 1979. And this is another fantastic Steve Jobs story. But what do you know about Steve Jobs' visit to Xerox PARC?
Well, I know that it pretty much fueled everything.
Yeah.
He got many, many ideas from there. Jobs visited Xerox PARC, which was PARC as the Palo Alto Research Center.
Uh-huh.
They were just shown lots and lots of new research and technology and ideas. And he stole them all, really. Used them for Apple, including the mouse.
It's interesting you say that, yeah, because in this keynote, he says that he was shown 3 things at Xerox PARC in 1979. And he was so blinded by the first one that he missed the other 2. He should have stayed a little longer and things could have been very different. So the first thing that he was shown was the GUI.
Mm-hmm.
So the graphical user interface, the mouse, as you said. And he was blown away by that. That was his real takeaway thing from visiting Xerox PARC. And he went away and developed the Lisa and then the Mac. But what he said in this keynote was that there were 2 other things that he was shown, but he was so blinded by the first thing that he didn't realize how important they were. And can you guess what those 2 things were?
iPod and the Apple Vision Pro.
It was object-oriented programming and networking. Mm-hmm. Those were the 2 other things that he was shown at Xerox PARC, which would prove to be massively important and way ahead of their time. but he didn't pay them much mind because as in his words, he was so blinded by the GUI. It was only years later that he realized how important object-oriented programming was. And we touched on object-oriented programming in our previous episode where we talked about NeXTSTEP. So this is a style of programming where you create these reusable code components called objects, and these objects can send signals to each other. And it was a very fashionable style of programming at the time, but it required programming languages that supported it. And this is something where Next was an early adopter, and they adopted Objective-C, and Objective-C was one of these object-oriented programming languages. And they introduced something called Interface Builder. An Interface Builder came over from NeXTSTEP to macOS, and it's still part of Xcode to this day, although nowadays they're sort of moving more towards Swift UI. The way that it works is you can pick a user interface element and make it communicate with another object and like literally just join it with lines in Interface Builder. And Steve Jobs demonstrated this, and he said that it massively reduced the amount of time that it would take to develop applications. And so the example that he gave is this would enable two people in a garage to get an app to market in 6 to 9 months.
Two people in a garage?
Yeah.
So he was aiming this product at, what, car mechanics?
So that was where Apple was in January 1997, just 2 weeks after they've signed the deal between Next and Apple. The idea was, we're going to rename NeXTSTEP Rhapsody. We're going to twiddle around with it to make it look a bit more like the Mac. We're going to have a blue box sort of virtualization environment for running Mac apps, System 7 apps. And then we're going to have yellow box, which is going to run these cool new object-oriented programs that you can build with Interface Builder. Fast forward a few months, and this is not working. The problem is no one wants to develop apps for yellow box because they would have to start from scratch. Rhapsody does later ship as a server operating system, but it's more of a curiosity rather than an operating system that anyone ever used because it just never had any software. There's no yellow box apps, and the blue box apps are not getting the benefit of the modern OS, then the whole thing is a non-starter.
Yeah.
So with the Rhapsody strategy floundering and Mac sales still flagging, shareholders looking for someone to blame, and Gil Amelio gets the boot. Amelio's biggest weakness was that he was not a strong presenter, and that was ultimately what did it for him in the end. There was an annual shareholder meeting in 1996. He did this absolutely terrible presentation. The share price plummeted again, and the board asked him to resign, which he did. They asked Steve Jobs to come back, which he wouldn't, but he agreed to come in as a sort of temporary advisor to help them get back on their feet. One of the things Jobs said about this period was he wasn't sure if he could be CEO of two companies at the same time. He wasn't even sure if it was legal, and he certainly wasn't sure that he had enough time to do justice to both jobs. But he is, in all but name, the CEO of Apple, and he's working with the team at Apple to figure out what to do about this. He's brought in his team. So two names that came up a lot in our episode on NeXTSTEP would be Arve Tavanian, who was the head of software, and John Rubinstein, who was the head of hardware. And he got both of them over to Apple to head up those same divisions respectively. And Arve Tavanian is absolutely key at this point, racking his brains to figure out how can we solve this. The Rhapsody strategy is not working. So one of the things that I'd said earlier is, it's all very well having an operating system, but if you don't have developers and you don't have users, you do not have a platform.
Yeah.
And actually creating the platform is almost as hard as creating the operating system. So what Gil Amelio had tried to do was buy in an operating system and put his platform on that. But his platform would not migrate to it. Developers didn't want to have to redevelop their apps from scratch, and the users didn't want to use it because all the apps that they were using would not get the benefit of the modern OS stuff that they wanted. So this is what Steve Jobs and Arve Tavanian are racking their brains trying to solve. And it takes them about a year. So we're going to fast forward now to May 1998. This is at the Worldwide Developer Conference 12 months later. Steve Jobs says this, and I'm going to send you a quote, Charlie. I know your Steve Jobs impression is not as good as your Johnny Ive impression, but I think you can maybe take a stab at it.
I'm going to try. Okay. I'll give it my best.
This quote you're going to read, Charlie, Steve Jobs puts a picture of a trash can on the screen with a load of screwed up paper in it, which presumably represents the Mac OS. And he says this.
10 months ago, when I got to Apple, a lot of people thought this was the future of macOS. In a trash can. Apple have been saying this for a few years. It was crazy. Because the macOS has 22 million customers, double that number of users. And it's one of only 2 high-volume OSs on the planet. 12,000 applications with developers who make their livelihood from it. Far from being something we should discard, it was very rapidly apparent that this was our crown jewel. It needs to be polished and extended.
So I think this is really key. It's not enough to just get a cool new operating system for the Mac. What Steve Jobs has come around to here is that actually he needs to make macOS a cool operating system.
Mm-hmm.
I think Gil Amelio was along the right lines in that the macOS needed to be based upon NeXTSTEP, and that was a great decision. It wasn't enough. This was not going to bring these 12,000 application developers across to the platform. Mm-hmm. Somehow they needed to make this platform macOS. Ironically, it wasn't even called macOS. It was a really shitty decision to call it Rhapsody. And I remember at the time I was confused by the name as much as anything else in this strategy. And I couldn't even get my head around, well, why is it called Rhapsody? We use macOS. What's this Rhapsody thing? When Mac's going to run Rhapsody? When you start up a Mac, is it going to say, welcome to Rhapsody? And why? That's just weird.
I always thought it was these things were just code names, development code names. But they're actually names.
It was going to be called Rhapsody. They were choosing to call it something that wasn't macOS. And by doing so, unnecessarily worrying their user base that we're moving to a new OS. Mm-hmm. Actually, what you want to do, if you've got lots of users and you want to bring them along with you, if you're going to do a radical change, you want to pretend it's not a radical change, mm-hmm. right? You want to present a continuity story. Where I was at this time in running design studios, all design studio managers and creative agencies were contemplating the shift to Windows NT from Mac, mm-hmm. which seemed at the time to be the future. That's what Adobe was saying. And what Apple was doing was saying, oh, we're going to move to a new operating system too. We're going to move to Rhapsody. So then if your choice is where you can either move from macOS to Rhapsody, which might not even be here a year from now, or you can move from macOS to Windows NT, it kind of reinforces the fact that whether you like it or not, you're going to be jumping OSs. Mm-hmm. Which OS do you choose to jump to?
Well, maybe it was an attempt to, for the people who had already gone to Windows. Okay, here's something. Here, look, we've changed everything, and now you can come back. Maybe, it's not a great idea, but that is the highest hanging fruit to try and get people who are already on a next generation operating system to come back to something untried and untested. Wired magazine published a cover story in 1997 with a picture of the Apple logo mm-hmm. all wrapped up in thorns. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, and underneath it said pray. People really thought Apple was not going to survive the year. So this was not the time to be talking about launching a brand new operating system. And Steve Jobs said that what he'd come to the realization was that macOS was their crown jewel. Mm-hmm. And he put this picture of a diamond up on the screen. And this is the presentation where he introduces Carbon. And of course, compressed carbon is what diamonds are made of. Before we get into Carbon, Charlie, I'm going to give you something interesting to read that Steve Jobs said. It's 18 months after Macworld San Francisco, where he stood on stage with Gil Amelio talking up this Rhapsody strategy. And 18 months later, he's putting the knife in. He's putting the boot in. He's saying that was a dumbass strategy to begin with.
Yeah. Is he doing a Jean-Louis Gasset on him? Stabbing him in the back.
It's a backstab. And this is what he says, Charlie. I'm sending it to you now.
What was this Rhapsody thing? It was some great technology. It ran old apps, Mac apps, and new apps. The problem was when you ran the old apps under this blue box thing, it didn't get any new features. To get the new features, you had to rewrite your entire app. No one wanted to do this. So we came to the conclusion, Rhapsody was great technology. It was going in the right direction, but it didn't give us what we wanted. So we decided to go further. People want an advanced OS that runs Mac apps.
And when he said that, he got a cheer from the audience, and people clearly did want that, so he was on the right track. But I love this thing where he said blue box thing.
Yeah, right.
It's so
stupid blue box
disdainful, but it's like, Steve, you were actually up on stage with Gil Amelio 18 months ago, and you were pitching exactly that. And so now he's really using distancing language to sort of disassociate himself with that Rhapsody strategy. He's pinning the Rhapsody strategy on Gil Amelio. Mm-hmm. This is where he announces macOS 10. Finally, we get to the hero of the story.
Yes.
And he puts a big macOS 10 logo on the screen, and the number 10 is written as the Roman numeral X. He says it's going to bring all of us and our apps along with it. and its parents are macOS 8 and Rhapsody. So just to quickly recap, the problem with Rhapsody was that it had these two environments for running apps, Blue Box and Yellow Box, but neither of them was a great solution. Blue Box could run all Mac apps, but they didn't get the benefit of the core modern OS features. And then there was Yellow Box, and that was great, but it required developers to completely rewrite their apps, and none of the big developers was willing to do that. So Steve Jobs and his software genius, Arvi Tevanian, solved that problem by coming up with a third box they called Carbon.
The Diamond Box.
The Diamond Box, exactly. So Carbon provided a quick and easy way for developers to port their applications to macOS 10 and get all the benefits of the modern OS features. So the way they did that was Tevanian and his team went through the code of macOS line by line, and they found that it had about 8,000 function calls. And a function call is basically how an application can communicate with the system. And of those 8,000, they found that about 2,000 were duds, and they were holding the system back.
Okay.
And if they could just get rid of those dud function calls and focus on the 6,000 remaining good ones, then they could get classic macOS apps to run natively on macOS 10. So they call those 6,000 good function calls the Carbon APIs. It was the missing part of the puzzle that revolutionized the dud Rhapsody OS and turned it into macOS 10.
Yes.
In order to figure out how many of the dud function calls versus the Carbon APIs an application was using, they developed a tool they called Carbon Data.
Oh, wow.
You see how we're extending this metaphor?
This is like a dad joke session.
So what they found was most apps were mostly using the Carbon APIs already. Only about 10% of their function calls were with the dud APIs, so it only required a small tune-up, not a complete rewrite, and then you could create an app that could run on this new box that sat alongside Blue Box and Yellow Box. But they stopped calling them boxes at this point, thank goodness, because
Thank God, I'm so confused.
Yeah. So Blue Box was renamed Classic, Yellow Box became Cocoa, and we had this new third environment called Carbon. Steve Jobs said if you were a developer of an existing classic Mac app, it should only take a couple of months to carbonize it for macOS 10.
Carbonizing.
Yeah.
Encase them in carbonite.
In case, like Han Solo,
Yeah.
right? So once you've carbonized your app, you get all the benefits of a modern operating system. You get the memory protection, you get the multiprocessor support, and the multitasking. So Carbon was the missing ingredient that propelled macOS 10 to success. Just a couple of months later, at Macworld Expo in Boston, Bill Gates appears on the big screen behind Steve Jobs and announces he struck a deal between Microsoft and Apple, where he commits to developing Office for macOS 10. And that was only made possible by Carbon. Okay, so there's one last part to this story, which is Aqua.
Ah, yeah.
This is one of my favorite parts. Steve Jobs, what he had said just after the purchase of Next was that Apple's mission should be to provide relevant, compelling solutions that customers can only get from Apple.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't enough to just catch up. And effectively, even macOS 10, as it had been described, wasn't leaping ahead of the competition. It wasn't doing something that only Apple could do. So the way Steve Jobs made Apple leap ahead was with a brand new user interface he called Aqua. And I sent you another quote, Charlie. This is how Steve Jobs describes it.
We have been secretly, for the last 18 months, developing a completely new user interface. We called it Aqua because it's liquid. One of our design goals is, when you saw it, you wanted to lick it. Very few people have seen this until today. We've kept this very secret, and it's my pleasure to show it to you now. That's the beginning of lickability.
Yeah, all the design language of the iMac was reflected in the UI of Aqua, and it all just tied together beautifully. The Aqua user interface actually looked like the translucent polycarbonate that they used to make their iMacs.
Aqua, well, it just looked exciting. It was a completely different look. So all the windows looked different. The icons for closing and maximizing the windows and things like this were the familiar traffic light candy colors we've got today. But it really was very, very different because it was stripy. It had it was white, but with a blue pinstripe going through. All of the red, yellow, and green window control buttons in the toolbar, they looked 3D. You know, they were like little jellies. What else? And it also had a lot of eye candy in there as well. So, for instance, the dock had a magnification trick to it. So, you know, you mouse over the dock, and in response to where your mouse was, the dock icons would get bigger and smaller.
It still does that today if you enable it.
Yeah, I switched that off. And then when you would minimize a window into the dock, it would kind of shrink and bend.
Which is the genie effect.
The genie effect. But the neat thing about that was that it would actually kind of bend and shrink the contents of the window as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, or you could move a window around with a video in it and it would keep playing. Or just the fact that you could move a window and with anything in it.
Yeah.
Instead of the window just blanking out until you have moved it and then redrawing.
Yeah.
It would keep the contents of the window visible. And this was all down to Quartz, right, that did this?
That's right, yes.
Was this a Quartz graphics layer which would take care of all of these neat things? I mean, it looked amazing, but the one thing I didn't like about it was whenever I would boot back into macOS 9, it always felt much snappier. The older operating system, you'd click a menu item and it would just instantly appear. It really felt much more responsive. Whereas when you were using the Aqua, the macOS 10 section, it would feel more sluggish. And partly it was because maybe the computer was struggling a little bit with all of this extra work. But also, it was the animations. You had animations which would, instead of just appearing on the screen, it would take a little while for, something to fade in from the side or to move. Or, when you mouse down to the bottom, even if you didn't have magnification on the dock could appear or disappear. And, even now, it's a bit annoyingly slow. I have a hack on my dock today, which enables it to appear instantly as soon as I put my mouse at the bottom, which won't surprise you.
You do surprise me. One thing as I was researching this episode I was surprised by is the look and feel we had seen before. Do you remember where we had seen the look of Aqua before macOS 10 was announced? I'm going to send you a picture of it.
Okay.
You see that?
Yeah, this is in the QuickTime.
This is iMovie.
Oh, is that iMovie? Oh, yeah, that's a bit bigger.
iMovie, which came out, I think, in 1999,
yeah.
A year before Aqua was announced, and it had Aqua-style scroll bars. And it had the Aqua-style kind of pinstripe background.
And it's even got brushed metal.
Yeah, and brushed metal as well, yeah. And all of this was running in macOS 9. Steve Jobs and his UI team had obviously been playing around with lots of these Aqua ideas in a special user interface that was a custom user interface for this application, which was iMovie. And what none of us knew at the time was this was a UI they were planning to roll out across the whole system. And this is a pattern you often see repeated with Apple, that they'll use some kind of tentpole app as a prototyping area to try out new things, particularly in user interface. So, for example, it happened again with iTunes, that Apple would often try out user interface concepts first on iTunes before rolling them out to everything else. Like CoverFlow was introduced first in iTunes, and it later appeared on the iPod and in the Finder.
That's typical Apple, though, isn't it? There's a lot of things that they work on under the guise of something else. Like all of the LiDAR stuff in the iPad. It's like, who cares about augmented reality on an iPad? And then you realise they've just been testing it to go into the Vision Pro.
When they first revealed the look of Aqua, it blew everyone's minds. I mean, it's maybe a bit maximalist by today's standards.
Yeah.
But it was just so visually stunning at the time. I remember being blown away by it. There was lots of eye-catching animation, but none of it was extraneous. It was all very purposeful to extend visual metaphors and explain what was going on. I think that, to me, almost as much as the lickable user interface, was part of what was brilliant and ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm. I like the animations. I just thought they were too slow.
Okay.
And it's a lot like with iOS and iPadOS as well today. It's that some of the animations are just a little bit slow, so it makes a very fast machine feel slower than it actually is. And I find this still frustrating today, and I wonder why they haven't fixed it.
Okay. I think what Steve Jobs had managed to do here was to pull off exactly what he'd set out to do, which was something that you could only get from Apple, something that was uniquely Apple. I don't think this stuff was perceived as important by the likes of Microsoft. The bit where Apple would always be in the lead, I think, is in the user experience and the user interface. And this, with macOS 10, with Aqua, is where Apple had leapt ahead once again. The last thing I wanted to say about Aqua is, I think if you're a youngling and you look at macOS 10, you might say, well, it's not that special. And it isn't, because there's much better user interfaces today. Mm-hmm. But at the time, I don't think you can overstate how stunned everyone was by it. This was a wow moment. And they got Rob Burgess on stage, who was the CEO of Macromedia at the time, which was a very important developer. They were the guys behind Flash. And he said, "I've never seen anything like this. It's just unbelievable. I'm speechless. This is not your daddy's operating system launch." This had blown his mind, and the guy worked in UI stuff, and he was blown away by it. It was that kind of really remarkable moment.
Yeah, I mean, it was very impressive at the time. It looked great. It looked like nothing else. It looked cool.
It did.
And it looked fresh and new. I mean, now it looks cluttered and old-fashioned, but in the same way that, the early iPhone UI looks like that. But when it first came out, it really felt like something modern. And then when you went back to the grey, more flat interface of Windows or earlier versions of the macOS, they felt very old-fashioned.
Yeah.
Apart from that, they were faster to use.
So then finally wrapping this up, one of the things I find really amazing is how fast this moved. So the acquisition of Next happened December the 20th, 1996. Within 6 months, Steve Jobs has got rid of Gil Amelio. Another 6 months later, he's the unofficial CEO. Another 6 months later, he's announced the macOS 10 plan. And so that brings us up to 98. 2 years later, macOS 10 is released as a public beta. That's in the year 2000. And then the first official shipping version is launched in January 2001. So just rounding this off then, years later, when in 2007 iPhone shipped, it shipped with a variant of OS 10 as well. They didn't call it macOS 10, they just called it OS 10. They later renamed that iOS. And for iOS, they introduced Cocoa Touch. Basically, it was running OS 10 with Cocoa Touch instead of Cocoa. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the demise of Carbon. Carbon is not in macOS 10 today. Apple deprecated Carbon in 2012 with macOS 10 Mountain Lion, and then they scrapped it altogether in 2016. Over the years, the likes of Microsoft and Adobe and everyone have rewritten their apps to work in Cocoa instead. So Carbon was an intermediate step. It basically got all those app developers, it got all of those users across from the classic macOS to macOS 10, and then eventually it was scrapped. And then the last part of the story is, even though we're on macOS 15 today, it's technically still macOS 10 under the hood, and applications still run in Cocoa.
Yeah.
So that's our story, Charlie. What do you make of it?
I think it's very interesting how when Steve Jobs came back and rescued Apple, we usually look at the iMac and then the iPod, the story from that point of view. But really, OS 10 is what has powered everything from macOS 10 at the beginning. And then, that's what is running in everything now, no? There's the Apple TV, the HomePod, even the Mac Studio display.
I wouldn't want to overemphasize the significance of the choice of NeXTSTEP over Windows NT or BIOS, because I don't think that's what this story is about. I think what this story is about is a platform is the people and a company is the people. And the platform people are the developers and the users. And the company people are the developers and the strategists and the designers.
You're sounding like a commie now.
It's sad, but it's true. People count. And that is what they bought with Next. That is what saved the company. It wasn't just Steve Jobs that saved the company, but it was the fresh influx of talent that his team brought with them that enabled Apple to figure out the Carbon strategy, that enabled them to migrate their fantastic user base.
Would it be correct to say that with Cocoa, Apple reduced its carbon footprint?
Oh, very good. Okay, so is there anything else you want to add, Charlie?
Nothing more about this.
I've silenced you once again.
You shut me up.
How do we round this up? So, Charlie, if people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
You can find me on Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social on Mastodon, and please send a message because nobody has sent me anything yet. So make that change.
Oh, Charlie needs someone to say hi to him.
Yeah, say hi.
Yeah, you can connect with me on Threads and Instagram and Blue Sky. I'm at Graham Bauer.
You're on Blue Sky now.
I'm loving Blue Sky. It's a new Twitter.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
But in a good way, right?
If you enjoyed this episode and you're feeling helpful and kind, then you could leave us a 5-star review or whatever number of stars you think we're worthy of.
Five.
In the Apple Podcasts app. It really helps with our visibility on the platform. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our sound engineer, Martin Augustin, for making us sound fabulous. And until next time, bye-bye.
Bye now.